I now identify as queer. So for me, my gender's female, like I use she, her pronouns. But in terms of my sexuality, I'm very much about the person, being attracted to the person rather than what's in their pants, let's be honest. It's about the person having that emotional connection. So I've been with men and women, attracted to, the person. So even, and non-binary identities as well. So for me, it's been a process and a journey. But now at 34, I'm very comfortable and confident speaking about myself. My work, I've worked in the LGBTIQ plus field for many years, especially with young people and trans and gender diverse young people in particular, in an advocacy space through health and education settings for about 14 years now. And so through that journey, I've learned more about myself and I've worked with some of the most inspiring and resilient young people I've ever met. So, that's got me to this point of now being able to talk very openly about all things gender and sexuality and myself and, what that means. And I'm happy to be here to do a bit of a 101 with you.
Yes. So my first question is, how old do you think kids should be when they start learning about the LGBTIQ? Can I abbreviate it? Is that offending anyone if I abbreviate it?
We could say rainbow community if it's...
Oh, that's pretty. I like that. But I'm going to ask you, how old do you think kids should be when they start learning about the rainbow community?
I think they should be as young as possible. That's my opinion. I think, but I mean, and the people think, if they're learning about the LGBTIQ plus community, they're learning about sex. There's this for some reason, there is this association between LGBTIQA plus communities and sex.
People think it's all about sex, though.
It's all about sex, right? And this is the thing that really does my head in. There are some wonderful children's books. I'm talking kids from as young as 1, 2, about families. Who's in my family? And this child's got 2 dads. This child's got 2 mums. This, as early as that. Yes. is when children should be learning there is difference in the world, there is diversity in the world, and that is absolutely okay. If I'm at kinder and 2 dads come to pick up my friend, that's normal. So to my mind, it's as early as possible, and it's not about this person has sex with this person. Children at that age don't understand that. They just know that these 2 people love each other. This is their mummy and daddy, or this is their 2 daddies, or this is their 2 mummies, or they've got a single mum. It's not even just about LGBTIQ plus communities. It's about, the different types of families. This is a foster child, like whatever it is. I mean, that can be learned from the youngest age, and then you build on that over time. So I say as soon as possible to start learning about the different people in our community. And it has nothing to do with who's sleeping with who. But this connotation, I guess, again, this is like back to like the way that the right wing like to portray the LGBTIQ plus community as sex fiends. The LGBTIQ plus community have no more or no little sex than everyone else. But it's I think that there's that association. We can't teach children about being gay at 5 years old, but it's actually not about teaching them about being gay. It's teaching them about diversity and inclusion and difference and acceptance. And so that's my thought on that one. I will argue till I'm blue in the face with anyone who doesn't believe that. Send them my way, Lisa, if you get any questions about that.
I will. So before we go through the acronym, why do I sometimes see same-sex attracted and gender diverse instead of LGBTQIA+?
Yeah, good question. I think, again, in working in this field, oftentimes you'll see, especially when it's to do with young people. So when the communication or the work is to do with young people, you often see same-sex attracted and gender diverse. And primarily that's because those terms don't refer to identity. Okay. So if you use LGBTIQ+, so lesbian, bi, trans, they are very fixed identities. Whereas for a young person, they might go, I don't know how I identify. All I know is I'm a little bit attracted to that boy or that girl or both of them. I know there's an attraction there. I don't know what that means for my identity. And I would also say that, that identity and sexuality and gender are all fluid. They can change over time. They can shift, with experience and whatever, and with maturity and whatnot. So we use same-sex attracted and gender diverse often when we're talking to younger people who may be questioning or who may be not wanting to use really firm identity terms at such a young age. And then the LGBTIQ+, once you get 18+, you'll usually say LGBTIQ+, QA+, as the overarching acronym. Yeah.
Okay. So, well, let's go through each of the letters in the acronym. I understand that some are very straightforward and pardon the pun, but they're being straightforward, but others may need more explanation. So L is for lesbian. I think we all know that's girl with girl.
Yeah.
G is for gay, but which types of sexuality can be called gay? Because some people believe that gay is only for men.
Yeah.
Some people think gay is an umbrella term. How would you describe the word gay?
Yeah, and I think that like the important thing to remember when describing the LGBTQIA plus community is that it's very individual. So I know some women who are attracted to women who say that they're gay, or they're dykes, or they're, they might say lesbian, or they might say, whatever else it might be. It's very individual. I think that that's the main thing. So some women will use the word gay, as instead of lesbian for their own reasons. Primarily, I mean, as we know it, mostly men use the word gay who are attracted to other men, but it can be used more broadly than that. Women, non-binary people might use gay. Again, very individual. Yeah, but just basically means you're not heterosexual.
Yes. And then you've got, B is for bisexual. And I think we were talking about it in the last episode that bisexual does not mean 50-50, that you like men and women equally, does it?
No, and I think that the interesting thing with bisexual over time is that word has been seen as a little bit limiting now, particularly because there are so many different ways that people identify. So they can be trans or non-binary or gender diverse, but be feminine presenting. And so then the word bisexual assumes there's two genders.
Yeah.
Bi means like two, so it assumes there's male and female, whereas a lot of people who identify as bi don't believe there's just two genders. Like they believe it. So then the word pansexual is being kind of used a lot more in the community as well now, which means it's just about the person rather than their gender. So bisexual on paper means I'm attracted to two genders, they're male and female. It's not necessarily 50-50. I don't think many people would be able to put a percentage to it. Like it's just a kind of, I'm attracted to not just the same gender as me. I'm attracted to both. And that's kind of the broadest way to describe that. Yeah.
So then pansexual, just for people who have never ever heard of that term before. So the way you're saying is the pansexual basically means you're attracted to the person no matter what, no matter whether they're trans, whether they're by themselves, whether they're a tomboy, so they can be basically just a person.
Absolutely. And I think that, but even it's interesting, even when I've talked to some people recently who identify as bisexual, and they were saying for themselves that they don't use pansexual, but that's basically what they're saying by being bisexual. They're not just attracted to two genders, they're attracted to all genders. And I think that's kind of shifted over time. But people who really want to get away from that binary of male and female will use the word pansexual to say, I can meet and connect with anybody regardless of their gender. I just like the emotional connection that then builds into that attraction. So I think that, pansexual is becoming more and more common because it recognizes that, even for people who are in a relationship with somebody, they might be in a heterosexual relationship, and then their partner might transition from one identity, so from male to female, and they might go, the person in that relationship goes, well, I thought I was heterosexual, but looks like I'm bisexual or pansexual because I still love this person. That's a good example of why people are getting much less attached to some of those terms now, around bisexual, for example, as being who they are, because that can change. Depending on your circumstance and depending on who you love, what they're going through. So pansexual is being used more and more of late, over the last few years.
And then we've sort of gone LGBT, T for trans. Now, the 5-letter word trans simply means, when you look it up, it says it means to the other side, or a cross, or a change, or a transfer. So it's often used to describe people who have changed their gender identity. Is that right?
Correct. And I think just as a bit of a disclaimer, I don't identify as trans or intersex. So it's worth saying that I can talk about, what these words mean, but in terms of the lived experience, obviously that is not for me to say. I've worked a lot in the space of transgender diverse experience, but obviously if you wanted to go deeper into that, there are plenty of people you can speak to, or you can speak to on the podcast. But in terms of what the definition means, you're correct. So trans is an umbrella term for somebody who is assigned a gender at birth they no longer identify with, and so it could be that you're assigned male at birth, and then you go, I'm not male, I'm female, and so, or you could say, I don't identify as male or female, I feel like I'm something else or someone else, and so trans is really an umbrella term to say that I don't identify with the gender I was assigned when I was born. So it's very broad.
And then the word transvestite and the word transsexual,
Yep.
they have different meanings too, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, transsexual is a word that, again, a little bit similar to the word queer. There are some trans people I know who embrace the word transsexual, who will use the word transsexual to define them or describe themselves. But there are many who find transsexual quite offensive. So it was a word that was used in a derogatory way.
I thought when I first heard that word, I thought it meant someone who changed their sex, as in their genders, their genitals.
Right. And so that's the
I
thing. And yes, I think historically that's kind of how it was used. I guess now there are people, especially in the older generations, who still prefer to use transsexual and don't see it as a they embrace that term and they've embraced kind of using that word. Whereas the majority of people I know and work with, especially younger ones, would never use transsexual regardless of what they've had surgeries, whatever. It'd always be transgender in terms of how they describe their experience rather than transsexual. And transvestite is more like about not about your identity, but about how you dress and present yourself. So it's about usually a male identified person dressing up in women's clothes or in, yeah. So it's not actually about feeling like a woman. It's more about how they express themselves. Same with cross-dressing. It's about gender expression rather than who they believe their gender to be within themselves.
Yeah. And I even wondered, are we still using the word cross-dresser, or are we just going to get rid of that term and just say they're just dressing how they want?
Yeah, I think it's still used. I think it's interesting because, again, it's very personal. Like all these terms, like, for example, there are some people I know who cross-dress who love the word cross-dressing and they love that it brings together community, around that, and drag and those kind of things. So I think that it's very individual. You'll have people in the community that hate the word transsexual or transvestite or cross-dresser. You'll have others who embrace it and who have actually found it really useful to have a community to, connect with. So it's kind of individual in that way.
Yeah. Well, the next word makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable, queer. And I recently have met people even younger than me that say, I'm uncomfortable with that word. It doesn't. So it's basically, it refers to anyone who is not cisgender. So cisgender, for our listeners, pretty much means that you have remained the same gender that you were born with. So I'm cisgender, for example. So it purely just means I still identify with the same gender I was born with. So that's
correct.
cisgender.
Yeah. So cisgender only refers to your gender identity. So whether you're male, female, non-binary, cisgender is only about gender. The majority of the world are cisgender. It's a word that was developed so that instead of saying trans and normal people, it's trans and cisgender people, because that's obviously highly inappropriate. So cisgender means on the same side. Cis means on the same side. Trans means across. Or,
I didn't know that.
So then you've got that interesting definition there. But so that word queer, like you were saying before, I think it's one of the words, again, like I was describing in the previous episode, that had been used in the past as a derogatory word, as a slanderous word. And I think over time, the LGBTIQ plus community have reclaimed that word as an empowering word, as defining themselves as different, but that's a great thing. That's not about being ashamed about that. So for myself, I use queer to say that I'm not straight, that I don't identify as heterosexual. And I think that, interestingly, people's identity terms can change over time. I might say queer now. In a few years, I might use pansexual. I might say lesbian. It can change depending on your experiences, depending on, how you know yourself to be. But queer is a really great term for anybody, who feels like they don't fit within, the heteronormative or heterosexual cisgendered kind of stereotype. But I also respect the fact that there are many people, especially older communities, even some younger, who find queer to be a bit of an uncomfortable word that brings up negative connotations. So I'm quite careful about how I say, how I talk about my identity, depending on the audience and who I'm around, and because I know that can be a source of pain for people as well.
Well, historically, queer could be used to replace the word weirdo.
Yeah. Same as people using the word gay, that's gay. It's a term that can be used as a derogatory or a slander. But I think over time, people reclaim words that are part of the community that they can embrace, and that takes away the power from the people who use it as a negative,
Yeah, so queer, it's almost like a bit of an umbrella term where if you don't fit into any other identities, wholeheartedly or whatever, you can say, I'm queer. I'm just not straight.
And straight away, if you say I'm queer, like the person you're talking to will know that you're not well, it's either about your gender or your sexuality or both, but they just know that you're not part of the, heterosexual cisgender world. So you're part of the rainbow world, that's your community. So I think that queer just signifies that you are, part of the rainbow community in some way.
Yeah.
Like in my opinion, and I think that there's, obviously a lot of research written about this as well, and there's many of academics that speak more eloquently about this than I do. But for me, gender and sexuality are not fixed, but they're also on a spectrum, not even a spectrum. It's like, every snowflake is different when it falls from the sky, that no two are the same. I feel the same about gender and sexuality. So for example, with sexuality, there's the Kinsey scale that looks at your attraction levels of, to men and women, and where you land.
What's
on
it
that
called?
scale.
A Kinsey
scale. So it talks about like where you sit in terms of your attraction. What it means though is that to say, just because you're attracted to the same sex doesn't mean you identify as queer or gay or lesbian or bisexual. You can be attracted to the same sex, but not feel it's part of your identity. There are plenty of married men, for example, or men in heterosexual relationships who sleep with men, but don't ever identify as gay. So your sexual acts or your sexual attraction doesn't necessarily mean that you will identify with one of those identity terms. So I think around lesbian, gay, bisexual, your sexual expression and the way that you navigate your sexual experiences doesn't necessarily equate to identifying as queer or gay. So those things are separate. For some people they align, like your sexual activity, the way you express yourself, the way you identify, all aligns. For others, not so much. And I think that sexuality is such a spectrum. And when I say spectrum, I don't mean there's a beginning and the end. I don't mean there's men at one end and women on the other. It's more like a kaleidoscope. That we're all like, I often say I don't think anyone's 100% straight, as a bit of a joke, but I think that's such a kaleidoscope, and it's so individual, and it shifts over time, as I said. And it doesn't necessarily mean that if you see a woman who makes you blush, it doesn't necessarily mean you identify as queer or bi or pan. So they're different things, that attraction compared to identity.
So we're up to the letter I. Now, does I mean intersex?
Yeah, intersex, and this is probably the one that
it doesn't mean that you're into having sex.
No,
it means intersex. ER in there.
Intersex. So intersex. And I guess the interesting part of intersex is it's actually not about identity. So the LGBT and Q are about your gender or sexuality identity, right? The intersex is actually about biology. So it's actually about people who are intersex are born with characteristics that are not wholly male or wholly female. So it's actually about your biological, your body, And so, for example, you can have a child who has feminine or female genitalia, but who has no womb or no uterus. And that means that person or that child would be labeled as intersex.
Right.
So intersex is more a condition or a characteristic than it is an identity. And so it's quite interesting because there's been a lot of advocacy over the years, and I highly recommend speaking to someone from organisation Intersex International, Morgan Carpenter, and one of the other advocates. I can give those contacts to you because there's been a lot of advocacy over the years to separate the I out of that acronym because it's very different. It's a medical, biological experience, and very different needs, very different areas of advocacy. There was recently a law that's come out in Victoria about protections for intersex children. And because there were gender normalizing surgeries being performed on babies, if their genitals weren't wholly female or male, there were normalizing surgeries to correct, inverted commas, genitalia to look more female or more masculine, so they would fit into the inverted commas normal society. So there are protections now for babies. So some people don't find out they're intersex until they try to have a child.
Wow.
And they might find out that they haven't got a womb. They might find out they haven't got a uterus, or they might find out they've got more male hormone, like higher levels of testosterone. So some people don't find out in their whole lives. Others find out around trying to get pregnant. Others find out as a baby because maybe it's their outward genitalia that looks different rather than what's inside their bodies. So it depends on what, I think, I can't remember how many, there's hundreds of intersex conditions, so it could be the genitalia itself, or it could be what's the anatomy inside the body that then defines you as intersex or an intersex condition or variation. But again, this is not my area of expertise. So I can talk about
what it means. Yeah.
It's definitely not my area of expertise. And actually within the acronym, that the intersex and sex people I've had the least experience with working with. And so that's my area where I'd say, certainly there are many people who can talk further on that, but that's just worth people noting, because often people get trans and intersex confused. But it's just worth knowing that trans is about your gender identity, how you think and feel, and who you know your gender to be. And intersex is actually about the biology of your body, and whether that is wholly female or not, or wholly male, or somewhere in between. So it's very different in terms of how that plays out for somebody and the issues you may face in life. So certainly very interesting. Whole episode could be just around intersex community.
Absolutely. And I can see why some people would say, it doesn't fit with the rest of the acronym, but at the same time, the LGBTQIA plus community is so inclusive and embracing that people who are intersex would they have much of a community if they weren't embraced by the LGBT?
It's quite interesting, because many people who I know who are intersex, they don't generally speaking, it might be that the intersex characteristics are not really a big part of their lives. That they might be straight and cisgender, but have high levels of testosterone, if they're born female. But it actually there's not a need for advocacy. There's not a need for community around that part of who they are. It's a little bit different. And I mean, this is not all people. Like some, there are intersex people who are trans, there are intersex people who are gay. That's a different thing, I think, to somebody who potentially doesn't relate or align at all with the rainbow community in any other way. But has an intersex condition or characteristic that, has affected them over time, but not necessarily in a way that they need community around them to support them through that, if that makes sense. So very different experience. But everyone's so individual. Everyone is different. There'll be intersex people out there who really resonate and connect with the LGBTIQ plus community. So, it's a very individual experience.
Yeah. And the A at the end, does it stand for asexual? Look, I've read 3 different words: asexual, aromantic, or allies.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The A is really interesting. So you'll probably hear me say quite a few times LGBTIQ plus, because I often don't, in a lot of organizations I've worked for in the past, we don't add the A. So it just depends, again, about the acronym. It's very dependent on the setting you're in or on your personal view. I guess the A can be any of those 3. And ally just means, what ally means. I suppose I'll define that for everyone else. Ally just means somebody who's not part of the LGBTIQ plus community, but who are supportive, of the community. For me, I don't feel like that needs to be part of the acronym. Others,
because isn't that me again? I'm an ally.
Yeah, that's right. So I don't think that, and it just, to me, it kind of just means that anybody's part of the rainbow community, which is fine. I mean, I can see there's positives for that. In terms of asexual and aromantic, similar in a way. Asexual is about somebody who might not necessarily want to be sexual with somebody, but may want a relationship of that's emotionally intimate, or that is intimate in other ways, but not necessarily sexually. And asexual, like all the other terms, is another area I haven't done as much work in, but I know for people who identify as asexual, it's a very broad spectrum as well. Some people might be, there's terms like demi-romantic now, that means that somebody might want to be sexual once they get to know a person. Once they have an emotional connection, then they are happy to kind of maybe be intimate sexually or physically. So there are many terms that fall under the asexual umbrella.
And not to be confused, asexual doesn't just mean married people who don't have sex anymore.
Doesn't everyone become asexual after 20 plus years of marriage?
I'm just wondering.
That's very funny. Yeah, so it's people who don't have that sexual drive, I guess, for physical intimacy. And aromantic, same thing, like potentially want a relationship, but not in a way that others would see a relationship. So aromantic might be that you might want a life partner who's more like a companion than a sexual or emotionally intimate partner. So it's just the whole spectrum of how people love and live, and
but I'm also thinking again, some people, they don't meet until maybe, and I'm talking about straight, people, they don't meet until they're, say, 70 years old. They're getting together sometimes just for companionship. And it's not about sex.
Absolutely.
So they could fall
Absolutely.
under that, but they don't, but then they're not really part of the LGBT
No.
community.
That's exactly right. Like people can fall under any of these parts of the acronym and not identify. Like Mum used to talk about a couple she knew that were really like in their late 70s, early 80s, two women lived together their whole lives. Like they were partners, like life partners, but they would never have identified as lesbians.
No.
You know, even though they'd lived a life together their whole lives as life partners. And so, you know, people, it's a very personal thing. And I understand why there are people who don't use those identity terms to describe themselves. There's lots of reasons for that.
I keep telling my girlfriends that's going to be my future. Like once all the men are gone, I'm just going to have a commune of women. All my best girls just live together, grow old together.
Sounds like a lot of fun.
Laugh it all out, bits that are falling apart and whatever. You know.
And that I guess that's a funny thing, like about the acronym LGBTQIA plus. The plus means everybody else. The plus means anyone who identifies as different to the mainstream heterosexual cisgendered world. So that can include non-binary, genderqueer, pansexual, you know, demi-romantic, all the different terms. There are like thousands really of terms that could fit in the plus. So really the plus is just to indicate that this acronym or this community is for anybody who's not straight, cisgender, like who's a little bit outside of those worlds. So
well, it makes me wonder again, in 30, 40 years, will this acronym change? Will it reduce? Will it, because the world will be more inclusive and people will be more educated and all this stuff.
Yeah, and look, really the main use of the acronym is to find like-minded people, but also for advocacy, like also to kind of really make sure that we're not, you know, looked over or missed, that we're considered in the work. So potentially in 30, 40 years, like it will just be second nature. There'll be no need for a separate community in that way. You know, you'll just be able to find like-minded people. You'll be able to be included in forums and in settings that you've never included in before. And so that's the dream that we can
well, that was going to be my next question, because, you know, I want to talk about gender types for a minute. When we fill out forms now, we see male, female, or other. So, you know, these, and then we're also seeing non-binary as well. So what's non-binary?
So non-binary, so the binary means two, so male, female, that is the binary, gender binary. So what the gender binary says is that there are only two genders that are valid. They are male and female. And that's what, I suppose, how our society has been taught, that there are two genders. And this is actually really interesting. It's a very Western thing, this two gender thing. There are many cultures where there's three genders or more.
Oh, really?
Especially in some of the Asian cultures. And and so the two gender thing, this binary male, female, and then that's it, is a very Western notion. So there are other cultures that have, you know, two-spirited people, or the third gender, or, you know, if you look around like Eastern Asian cultures, even like Native American cultures, this is a very westernized view of gender and the binary that fits within that. So I think for non-binary basically means you fit outside of the male-female binary, right? It's my dog, if you can hear him. So for someone who's non-binary, that says it's an umbrella term again for anybody who doesn't feel male or female, but they might be somewhere in between. It might be fluid. Some days they may feel more masculine, other days they may feel more feminine. The non-binary experience is very individual, and there's many versions of what that looks like for a person. But it just means that I don't feel wholly male or wholly female, and that may fluctuate. Some people might say I'm non-binary but feminine presenting. So for some non-binary people, if you just saw them on the street, you might assume that they're female, but where in fact they're non-binary and they use they, them pronouns. So basically on a form, the reason why we're seeing now male, female, non-binary is because it's showing that there are it's kind of, I'm trying to explain it in a nutshell. So basically the word trans, many trans and gender diverse people wouldn't use the word trans to identify their gender.
Right.
Most people would say, you know, I'm a woman with a trans history.
Yes.
To indicate that, yes, I wasn't assigned this gender at birth, but I am a woman, no less valid than the next woman.
Yes.
Right? So if on a form it said male, female, trans, it would assume that the person filling that out is not female, is not male, they're trans. This other gender that's not the gender they feel they are, right?
Yeah.
Whereas non-binary is different, because non-binary says, I identify as neither male or female.
Yeah.
So that is actually a valid identity term that someone would use to describe their gender, whereas trans isn't an identity term, it's an umbrella for your experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like I've got a really close friend named Rachel who I adore, who is a woman with a trans history. So depending on where she goes and what she does, she would never disclose her history. In 99% of settings, she would never disclose that she was born male or assigned male at birth. She is a woman, and so there's no need for her, like on a form, if it said male, female, trans, she would tick female. Right. And so if there was a follow-up question that said, were you assigned a different gender at birth, she would tick yes. I was. So that would indicate that this person has a trans history. They're a woman with a trans history. And that's the difference. So now on forms it will say male, female, non-binary, and those are three kind of valid, identity terms. It might say other, because someone might want to say I'm a trans man. They might use trans man as their identity term as a way of kind of advocacy around, I want to be seen as a trans man. That's cool. Like, as I said, it's very individual. And so depending on some settings, like for example, in medical settings, I know a number of trans people who would disclose that they're a trans man or woman because it pertains to their medical treatment.
Absolutely.
Right. So in general world, though, most trans people I know would not disclose if it wasn't pertinent to what.
I don't even know where it would be appropriate other than medical, really.
Other than medical. And so, that's the thing with non-binary, though, it's different again, where it's excellent to see that there's a non-binary option on forms, because it means that there's not just two genders that are valid. Like, there's not just a male and female binary. It's interesting because a lot of trans people I know are very binary in the way they present. Like Rachel is a woman who with a trans history, but she's very binary in the way she presents. Like she's very, when I say binary, I mean she presents like my mum. Who was assigned female at birth and who is cisgender. So Rachel is not, when she expresses her gender, it's not like androgynous, or she is very binary. She's attracted to men. So she's living this kind of like, binary in the binary world these days. And the fact that she's got a history that's trans is kind of like it doesn't factor in to the way that she lives. So that's why, on forms, it's important that we make sure that, that there is the option for non-binary and there is an option for other if possible, so people can specify if they do want something else listed. But to have male, female, trans is absolutely not the direction that organizations should be going.
No. Just for people who have no idea about pronouns, so, I want you to really answer this for people that really know nothing about it. Why are people using different pronouns, do you think?
Yeah, so pronouns are the way that we describe ourselves, or an easy way to think about it is when you're talking about somebody, like what gendered terms do you use? So if you're talking about your sister, you would say she does this, she went there. If she identifies as female, that's how you would address her. The thing that with that though, for someone who's non-binary, they may not feel wholly female or wholly male. So a term like she or he doesn't fit who they are. So then even though it sounds grammatically incorrect to say, if you're talking about one person, to say they are over there or they are going here when it's only one person you're talking about in the singular, that's the term that's most closely resonating with people who are non-binary, who don't want to use she or her or he or him, but who want to use something else. And they, them says that they don't identify with either male or female identities. Some people might say she, they, as you said, because maybe they're comfortable with a more feminine identity, but they also feel there's a part of themselves that doesn't align completely with feminine identities. So that's really common as well. But if you do see they, them, that's really about this person being non-binary and feeling like they don't identify with male or female. And that's the appropriate. And this is the thing that's tricky, especially if you're over the phone. If someone, I've seen examples of this. I've got a really great video that I can share with you after this, Lisa, but for example, if you answer a phone and someone has a really quite deep voice, you'll make assumptions about their gender. Like you'll go, hi, sir, the person might go, no, I'm female, right? So to try not to use gendered terms, say like, hi, how are you today? Rather than saying hi, sir, is really useful, because either the person might be have a trans history, or they might be non-binary. Their voice might not align with their gender expression or the gender terms that they use for themselves. So the pronouns are really important to think about that. I've seen that example play out in real life as well. When I used to work in a health center and a non-binary person came into the center and said to the receptionist, where are the toilets? And she said, the male toilets are there, making an assumption that they're the toilets that this person would want to use. and they said, oh, do you have, you know, unisex or gender neutral toilets, because that's where
Yes.
I feel comfortable. And so the person's like, oh, sorry, you know, like, and moved and told them where the gender neutral toilets were. But this is why those assumptions aren't helpful. You know,
Yeah.
they're saying that's where the male toilet is. It's like, these are where this is where the toilets are, like, without,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
misgendering the person.
Or just go gender neutral, male, female.
Yeah, exactly.
Pick which one you want. Yeah.
Exactly. But these are things that take practice. Like, it's not something you
Yeah.
naturally think of because of the way they've been educated and taught about genders.
Yeah. And I, you know, there is a lot of talk about having that third toilet in schools as well. And I know that going back a few years ago, I know a young person who she felt uncomfortable that one of her classmates, who was assigned male at birth but identifies as female, was going to use the girls' toilets. And she felt uncomfortable, but she knew she couldn't speak up.
Yeah.
And it just, and I can understand why she felt that way. And she's young. She was like 16 years old. You know, you feel very self-conscious of everything, let alone having someone hearing you pee through the, you know, the cubicle or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think schools need to start really thinking about having that third toilet available, just so that people can just be themselves and make that choice
and choose which one. It's really interesting, you know, because the research shows us that you know, one of the most unsafe places for trans and gender diverse people are the toilets. So if anybody is going to be attacked or bullied or, you know, have a negative experience, it'll be the trans and gender diverse person themselves. So it's really interesting that, you know, I've heard examples of children holding on and not going to the toilet all day for fear of using a bathroom, who end up with kidney issues because they're holding on to not wanting to use a toilet the whole day. You know, there are lots of issues like that because, you know, especially as young children, you know, if you're questioning or you haven't gone through your gender affirmation process. So we're using the word gender affirmation rather than transition more so these days. Gender affirmation is about affirming, you know, if you're assigned male at birth and you identify as female, it's about affirming your feminine identity or female identity through your hair and clothes, rather than saying, you know, transition from one to the other. You simply start affirming your gender from, you know, to align with who you are. And so for somebody who's going through a gender affirmation journey, especially at a young age, they might not feel comfortable using either toilet because they might be exposed in either toilet to bullying, to aggression, to whatever it might be. So having a gender neutral toilet or an all gender toilet that's not a disability based toilet.
Exactly.
You know, having a toilet that's for disabilities and for other genders, like, it's problematic for lots of reasons.
Yes.
And so, you know, having a gender neutral toilet is the best option. I mean, it's really interesting because what some schools have talked about that I've met with in the past have talked about just having all single cubicles without any signage, because they're just single cubicles, which makes a lot of sense to me. And same with offices, like, rather than having, you know, female male toilets and gender neutral block of toilets, just having single cubicles with no sign, like just a toilet sign on all of them.
And in some ways, getting rid of that trough in the boys' toilets can also alleviate some of the bullying that happens as well.
That's right. Just having single cubicles, like a series of them, with just a toilet picture on the front to say these are all toilets, it alleviates a lot of those issues.
That's a bloody brilliant idea. I think we should advocate for that.
Take it to the top.
Yes. Yep. Right. I'm going to change the toilets in Australia.
Yes, Lisa.
Toilet queen.
Yeah. That could be a legacy, the toilet queen.
Yep. It's amazing though how something that could be viewed as something so small can make such a big impact. Like looking at you, you know, growing up, and a lot of other people like myself, I didn't want to get changed in front of other people because I was an early developer. All that sort of stuff.
Absolutely.
So to give people that privacy if they need it and want it, I think that's really important, especially in those years when you're so self-conscious.
I agree. And it's interesting, like even now, like even as an adult, like when I've been wearing my mask, obviously, you know, for people who can't see an image, I've got short hair. So when I wear my mask, I've been addressed as sir a few times. and even with toilets, like, oh, so the male toilets are there. And I'm like, pull my mask down, like, I'm a woman, I'm going in there. But even that, like having to like deal with that shit, like I'm a very confident like person, that's never going to affect me, but others aren't. Others could find that really intimidating. So if there were just cubicles anywhere,
Yeah.
it would be you'd be much less kind of concerned about being so visible and being potentially, experiencing violence, or
as long as
discrimination.
as long as men know where to aim, I'd be happy
I
with
mean,
it.
yeah, that's a whole other issue, right?
Yeah. So tell me, people are often worried that they might say the wrong thing when it comes to gender, so saying he, she, they, and so on.
Yeah.
Now, the best advice I've heard is to quickly correct yourself and move on, because quite often people don't want an apology or an explanation. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were, they don't want to hear it necessarily. It's just, sorry, correct yourself, move on.
Correct. And that's the best advice. I mean, it's really interesting because in all the young people I've worked with, in particular, hundreds of young people who are, gender diverse, they all say the same thing, that they can very much see the difference between a negative intention and a positive intention. So if they feel like somebody's using the wrong gender term intentionally to be hurtful, that's a very different thing to somebody who has made a genuine mistake. And so I always say to people, it's about the intention that you bring, right? So if you make a mistake, as exactly what you said, to say, I'm really sorry about that, I'll try not to do that again, and move forward. But really, for the person that you're dealing with or speaking to, they will see the intention. So 9 times out of 10, if you just apologize and move forward, it won't be an issue at all. The only time it will be an issue usually is if the intention is, to be awful, really, to use a term. I've heard examples of in the past of some young people I've worked with whose teachers use the wrong gender terms as punishment.
Oh my God.
If they're not listening or behaving, they'll use their, the wrong name and the wrong gender terms as punishment. So if the person feels the intention is negative, then you're obviously not going to get a very nice reaction back. But if the intention is not to offend, but it's just a genuine mistake, and you go, oh, I'm really sorry, I'll correct that and move forward, I don't think I've ever seen that be an issue. So as you said, apologize, move on, that's it. And the person will see that you're trying. It's your intention is to say the right thing. That's the main thing you can do.
So at the moment, I mean, the spotlight is really on diversity and across many corporations and workplaces. But we often hear people say, why should we employ her just because she's a woman, or why should we employ him because he's gay? Now, my answer to this is simple. History's provided straight men with the education and skills to fill a lot of these jobs, and it's still very much a boys' club in that world. And we know that, the best companies bring together people of different lived experiences in order to grow in a diverse world. We need different minds to come together. There's no room for companies that are small-minded anymore, and I wouldn't want to work for one. So part of what you do is diversity. Why do you think that diversity is important in the workplace, just in your opinion?
Yeah, it really aligns directly to what I'm doing at the moment. My role is more around workforce diversity and inclusion. A lot of my career has been working directly with young people and in the community, and this role is more about the workforce itself. And absolutely what you've said there, diverse workforces where there's a mix of ages, cultural backgrounds, sexualities, genders are more successful. And even for private companies, there's research that shows that your business actually grows quicker and does better financially when there is diversity in the fabric of your employees. So I think that, as you said, different ideas, different cultural backgrounds bring different perspectives, and I think that having a really homogenous, everyone's exactly the same business will no longer get you to where, it might have 50 years ago. We're in a different world where we need different ideas, different brains and different thinkers to come in and share. And so when you've got an environment that is inclusive and equitable, people function better. If you can come to work as your whole self, you're always going to get way more out of that person.
If someone is feeling discriminated against at work and they don't feel like they can turn to someone at their own workplace, what organisations would you recommend for people to reach out to?
In terms of who to speak to if you are experiencing discrimination in the workplace, it would depend on, I guess, what that discrimination was related to. For example, you've got the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, who is basically a one-stop shop in terms of if you're experiencing discrimination, you can reach out to the Equal Opportunities and Human Rights Commission for advice. They've got a series of lawyers and other legal experts that you can actually reach out to voice a concern or a complaint around discrimination. And that's around protected attributes. So protected attributes include gender, sexuality, disability, age, race. So any of those protected attributes, you can reach out to the Human Rights Commission for advice around how to handle that. I mean, if it's in a workplace, there are a whole series of things that usually occur related to discrimination, one of which, you'll usually be able to link in with an EAP, so Employee Assistance Program, where you can speak to a psychologist or a counsellor. And then most times you'll be directed to reach out to your HR advisor around lodging a formal complaint, if that's the direction you choose to go, and then for that to be handled through a series of, whether it's mediation, or it depends on the nature of the discrimination, but certainly the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission would be the first port of call. And then it depends. So say, for example, you're in the LGBTIQ plus community and you experience some discrimination or bullying related to your identity. There are many organisations you could reach out to for peer support, for advice, including Switchboard, which is a LGBTIQ plus telephone service where you can get advice around what's happening, or speak to somebody who's a peer who's from the LGBTIQ plus community, and voice kind of your concerns about what's happening, and they can give you some advice on what to do about that. The switchboard's for anything, not just around discrimination. It could be around experiencing mental health concerns or whatever it might be. It's about speaking to a peer who's trained to help you with navigating that process of seeking support. There are other organisations, like I said before, like Organisation Intersex International. There's a lot on their website about rights for intersex people. So depending on, and even around cultural diversity, there's Foundation House. There are other, organisations that have a lot of information included around discrimination. And so it depends on kind of, I suppose, the protected attribute or the part of your identity that you feel like is being attacked, or the discrimination experience around disability. There's a whole other range of services that you can contact. But as I said before, for my advice, the first point of call would be the Victorian Equal Opportunities and Human Rights Commission. And that would direct you around where to go next, basically, if it's not them,
And you've done a lot of work with young people as well. Is there certain services that are specifically for them as well?
Yeah, and depends on what's going on for them. So, for example, if it's around like peer connection, there are groups like Minus18. There are groups like Transcend, who are for parents of trans and gender diverse children, who are great advocates. There's Safe Schools, who are part of the Department of Education and Training, who can support trans and gender diverse young people to affirm their gender at school. There are many organisations really that you can reach out to depending on what it is that you need, So these days, luckily, with a quick Google search, a whole range of supports for LGBTIQ plus AQ plus young people and adults to support them within a school or workplace. And so, which is wonderful. And, because in 2013, there was an amendment to the Sex Discrimination Act that meant that it's actually unlawful to discriminate against somebody based on their gender or sexuality, which means that, because before that, you could technically be fired if you want to affirm your gender in the workplace.
Ridiculous.
That's illegal. So, those protections are crucial for people to be able to be themselves and to come to work as their whole selves and feel like they've got legal protections for around that. So, there's obviously different ways of recourse in terms of following up any issues you may be experiencing, depending on the nature or the gravity of what's happened.
It just blows my mind that anyone could ever think that someone's sex life could actually have anything to do with their performance at work.
Absolutely.
It's ridiculous.
I agree.
We've come a long way, but we've got a long way to go, to be honest.
I agree.
If you what do you think is needed to change, do you think, even at a government level, a state or federal level?
It's a really good question. Do you mean
is there anything they could be doing better that is helping people, you know, the rainbow community and everyone else, to allow them to be themselves in whatever situation they're
So
in.
not just in the workplace, you mean more
Not
broadly?
just, yeah, even broadly.
I think it goes back to what we're talking about probably in the previous episode, is around really investing in early education.
Yeah.
Like really early education for children, but also in investing in, you know, I suppose it's difficult to kind of put words around this, but in somehow legislating inclusion in settings. For example, you have to, like, there is no choice but to have gender neutral toilets.
Yeah. Yeah.
Legislating like what's on forms, legislating, you know, accessing into spaces that aren't necessarily inclusive. For example, you know, if I go into a health service, they have to have at least these 3 identifying terms on their forms. They have to have these toilets available. They have to have, you know, like,
yeah,
it's actually no choice from by that service of whether they do it or not. Like, it's
Yeah.
legislated. So I think that if you can create spaces that are safe and accessible, and that those things are legislated rather than a choice for that
Yeah.
service, that will start to shift as well some of the inclusion that people feel or not.
Yeah.
But I think, like, in terms of future generations, I think really investing in what we were talking about earlier, like actively making, you know, sure that children are learning about different families, about, you know, diversity from a really young age, having somebody from the Aboriginal community come and speak about, you know, their culture very early on, like LGBTIQ plus diversity, but like all diversity, like, you know,
Absolutely.
racist, more inclusive country.
Yeah.
Because I think that you know, this work I'm talking about around inclusion is not just around sexuality and gender, but it's about everything: race, disability, you know, like culture. I think that there's a long way to go in all those areas in Australia, and I think government could do a lot more in terms of investing in, you know, investing in diversity and inclusion in a really meaningful way.